I think this is in many ways the most important part of the book of Exodus and one of the most important parts of the Bible. One of the interesting things is that when Hollywood gets hold of these things, it always tends to focus on the wrong things. Like when we see movies, say, I know some of you watch yearly the 10 Commandments. There's a lot made of the Golden Calf episode. But the most important thing in this segment is not the Golden Calf episode, it's what follows it. We're going to see God and Moses in a fair amount of tension, more tension than we've seen between them since early on, chapters 3 and 4. I mentioned before a pattern that shows up several times in the Bible. There's a promise, a divine promise made, and very quickly thereafter, at least in the pages of the Bible, there's a threat to the promise. Some of them are minor threats, some of them are major. It's already happened once in the book, back in chapter 4, when the life of Moses is in danger. Right after he's accepted the call, finally, it says that Elohim, some God, is apparently setting out to seek his life. That's a threat to the promise. Back in Genesis, we had a whole variety. No sooner are Abraham and Sarah called to and given a whole bunch of promises about a land, about a blessing. Then they get to the land, and immediately there's a famine, which makes them leave the land. Threat to the promise. Or, finally they get the child that's been promised for 12 chapters, and then there's a threat to his life. Take your son, your only one whom you love, and sacrifice him on one of the mountains that I'm going to show you. That's a major threat. Okay, it's happening again. This time, however, it's happening because one of the covenant partners has reneged on the promises, and that's the people. Now, what are the promises in Exodus? Well, there are a variety of them, or rather, I should say, there are a variety of tangents to them. But the four most prominent are, they're all about freedom. Freedom from the clutches of Egypt, that's already happened. They are out. They are no longer slaves. Then there's the freedom which underlies that. The point of the Exodus is the freedom to worship the ancestral God. Now, in a sense, they're free to do that, but it hasn't really happened yet. And what they're doing with the golden calf gets in the way of that. Freedom to become people of God. They've accepted that offer, and they've actually come a little ways in becoming that people. This, however, this golden calf thing will wreck that. And then they have the freedom to settle in the promised land, which was promised way back to Abraham and Sarah. That won't happen now. It won't happen in the book of Exodus. It won't happen until the book of Joshua. Now, along the way, since they've been free of Egypt, there have been little jerks, little hiccups in terms of the promise. And they've all been on the side of the people. So you'll remember all the murmuring about water. They didn't have water to drink. That happened twice. They were hungry. They were embroiled in some sort of battle with the Amalekites. And even before any of that, they were scared out of their minds when they first approached the sea with the howling Egyptians to their rear. So they're between literally the rock and the hard place, the sea, which seems unending, and these people who are out to kill them or drag them back to slavery. In each of those instances, however, the difficulty was legitimate. They really were thirsty. They really were hungry, et cetera, et cetera. And on each of those occasions, what did God do? God nurtured. God took care of them. So even these little hiccups were satisfied. But everything has now changed because of what happens when they reach the mountain. They got there in 19. The beginning of the covenant happens in 20. And as you will remember, because that's where we left off last week, in 24, they have the sealing of the covenant with the special meal, the rituals. The people have now said twice, once in a very ritual way, that yes, they do accept the offer of the covenant, they will be God's people. They will act like it. They will become the people of God, and God has agreed to take them on. So from here on out, when they begin to complain, when they set their own agenda, things are going to be different, because now their complaints are going to be illegitimate given the promises they've just made. It's not going to happen much more in this book. The golden calf is the biggie, but it'll happen throughout the remaining years. Remember, they're in the promised land. They're looking for the promised land for 40 years. And there are going to be other times in the books that fill out the rest of the Pentateuch where they have major stopgaps. There's one place where they complain that they're hungry again. It happens in the book of Numbers. But they're not really hungry. They are missing the food that apparently they're dreaming of now that they used to have in Egypt, or at least used to be available in Egypt. So it's not that they're dying of starvation. They've got the manna. It continues the whole time they're in the wilderness. They just don't like it. What they're really complaining about is God's plan. They don't want to continue with God's plan. From here on out, once the covenant actually happens, their complaints in the future tend to be much more illegitimate, and God will respond in very different ways. The God before the mountain always responded, never showed any trace of anger, exasperation, or impatience. That's all now going to change. In chapter 24, Moses had gone to the tippy top of the mountain. We leave the people at the bottom of the mountain, the elders somewhere up the mountain with Moses, where they enjoy the ritual meal together. And then at the tippy top of the mountain is Moses with God, enveloped by that cloud for a tete-a-tete with God. And that's where Moses will remain for the requisite 40 days and 40 nights. And the people, when last we heard about them, were at the foot of the mountain, and they had been dazzled by their experience of an encounter with God. And remember, I said that the text itself says that they saw, but what they saw was in fact a hearing. They heard the voice of God speaking to Moses, but it was such an overwhelming experience that the narrator explains it as something they saw. Now they see something again, but this time what they see is bereftness. Moses, who had finally been accepted by them as the leader and mediator. Remember in 20, when that mountain was rocking and rolling, they said to him, "We're not going to come near the mountain. We don't want to go up the mountain. You go up there and find out what's happening." So finally, they accept him as a spokesperson, as a mediator, as the one who stands between them and this God that they're just re-meeting. They're still out in the middle of nowhere, and their leader is gone. It's been more than a month. They don't know where he is. Now what are they supposed to do? So what they want from Aaron is some tangible, visible entity that'll get them through the wilderness. They're hardly out there and have had needs taken care of. But now what do? It's been more than a month. It's 40 days and 40 nights. I just want to mention one little thing about these 40s. Some of you, maybe all of you, know about them, but there are a lot of them in the Bible. So obviously the flood back in Genesis, Moses is up and down that mountain, and often when he goes up the mountain, it's going to happen twice in the segment that we're studying tonight. He's up there 40 days and 40 nights. The crowd's reaction to it is very different. The first 40 days and 40 nights is where we are now. There's going to be another one. The response is going to be very different. Israel, it hasn't said it yet. It will later talk about Israel in the desert for 40 years, wandering around. It'll mention it through the rest of the Pentateuch, and it'll even mention it in the prophets. And I believe there's at least one psalm that mentions it. Elijah when we get to prophets, Elijah, you will remember, he has a contest with Jezebel's prophets in 1 Kings 17 and 18, where he essentially invites them to a contest and they lose badly and he kills them all. 400 prophets of Jezebel. She is understandably upset by this and sets out to kill him. So, like Moses before him, he runs in fear for his life into the wilderness. And like Moses, who meets God out there, Elijah also will meet God in the wilderness, but it takes him 40 days and 40 nights. Then there are the Ninevites in Jonah. When Jonah finally, very reluctantly, takes up the mantle of prophecy, which he doesn't want either, in chapter 3, he gives his one and only prophetic speech. Yet 40 more days, says Jonah, and Nineveh will be utterly turned upside down. And then there's Jesus in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He goes out into the wilderness. He either goes out there led by the Spirit or propelled by the Spirit, that's Mark, into the wilderness where he is for 40 days and 40 nights to be tested. All of these 40s, and there are more than these, all of these 40s have some sort of ordeal at their heart. Very often there's a test or testing involved. And always at the end of it, the person or persons who have been tested come out transformed in a way, ready for their ministry, their new vocation, or something like that. It's one of those motifs that stretches right from Genesis all the way through into the New Testament. Now, I want you to pay attention to the great contrast between the last thing that we hear Israel say in chapter 24 and the very first thing they say in chapter 32. Now, the intervening chapters, the people aren't involved at all. It's only Moses and God on top of the mount doing business. So it really is the last time we've heard from the people, whether we read chapters 25 through 31 or not. The last time we hear from them, they say, and it's an oath, it's a vow. Everything that Adonai, that the Lord has said, has spoken, we will do and we will hearken, which means obey. We'll be those people. We'll do all those 10 words. We'll do all the stuff in the covenant code. We'll do it all. Now they say to Aaron, arise, make us Elohim. Elohim, remember, means, it could mean God with a capital G. It could mean God with a small g. It could mean gods. Here, it probably means something like gods, who will go before us. For this Moshe man who caused us to go up from the land of Egypt, we do not know what happened to him. 40 days, 40 nights. They don't know what happened to him. A couple of things to notice. They are saying that it's Moses who caused them to go up from the land of Egypt. And of course, he's the only one that they know of who led them out of Egypt. But back at the bush, and actually what they heard on the mountain, is that it's God who caused them to go up from the land of Egypt. And here's the we do not know. Pharaoh did not know this character. In fact, 2 pharaohs. The first Pharaoh didn't know Joseph. The second Pharaoh didn't know and didn't care about, didn't acknowledge, didn't respect the one whom Moses is representing. So there's a huge difference between what they promised and what they now want. And what they're doing is switching their primary allegiance. I mean, the first words were, I am the Lord your God. I'm the one who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Don't have any other gods beside me. Don't even make any graven images. That's the first of the words. And now they're violating. They're switching their primary allegiance to the calf as a new tangible messenger to go before them. One other little thing before we leave this part, and that is the expression go before us. That's been mentioned, though I didn't mark it each time that it has been mentioned. It's been mentioned 3 more times earlier in chapters 14, 23, and 32. And it was always a messenger, that is a sort of extension of the Godhead, who would march before them to lead them on the way. What they want is something that's tangible, that will now lead them. It's not as if they're looking for an alternate God. They just want something more tangible, more real, something they can connect to.